I also wanted to take a moment to introduce our head table. You'll see several of the folks at the table actually on stage over the course of this morning. But first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Mark Bane. You all know Mark Bane is a partner at Tories, but also the chair of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. Also Ehren Cory. Ehren is the president and CEO of Infrastructure Ontario, if you didn't know that already. Damien Joy, who's a partner infrastructure advisory at EY. And thank you again for being a sponsor. Moya Graham, who's a partner at McCarthy Tetro. Moya is here in that capacity, but also representing the Women's Infrastructure Network, or the Women in Infrastructure organization, which I want to talk about in just a moment in a little more detail. And Jensen Clark, who's now a director at Fengate Capital Management. You know him well. And of course, David Ho, Executive Vice President, Procurement and Program Management at Infrastructure Ontario. And both Ehren and David will be on stage in just a short while to tell you everything you wanted to know about how Infrastructure Ontario is going to recalibrate its efforts to become just an unbelievable organization and maintain the reputation that they already have in the marketplace. One thing I wanted to mention, and I made quick reference when I introduced Moya, many of you in the room would be familiar with the Women's Infrastructure Network. It's good to see many women here with us today. I'm particularly pleased, you may know they have an annual awards program, and that took place just a couple of days ago right across the country. And they take that opportunity to recognize an emerging leader, and this year's recipient of that award was Chloe Doucette, who's a railway project engineer with Kiewit. It was really wonderful. And the Outstanding Leader Award recipient is someone nobody knows, Vicky Turnbull, of course, with the Royal Bank. So please, again. It's really great to see both of them recognized. It's an interesting time in Canada when you're thinking about infrastructure and particularly public-private partnerships, and I think interesting in a very positive way. As you know, there have been some changes, political changes over the country in the last little while, and they've actually had significant implications for investments in infrastructure and in public-private partnerships. While the election hasn't taken place yet in Newfoundland and Labrador, that's coming up in a couple of weeks. As you know, Newfoundland and Labrador has moved ahead significantly with P3s in the marketplace, particularly in the health sector, and now they're moving ahead with a new prison, which they'd like to deliver using a P3 approach. Very encouraging. Of course, Alberta has a new premier, and if you heard his remarks on the night that he was elected, he made reference again to infrastructure and his commitment to using P3s. So that is a return to what was a very buoyant market, and we're hoping that will roll out in a very significant way over the coming months. And of course, here in Ontario, a very significant commitment to infrastructure in the budget of $144 billion, and particularly about $28.5 billion dedicated to public transit projects. And again, a very vocal commitment to using the P3 model to deliver on many of those projects. So it's a very encouraging time, and I'm hoping that's viewed in exactly the same way by all of you in the room. And I know you're here because you really want to be part of that action, but also to understand how Infrastructure Ontario is working on its model. I mean, we all know that Canada is recognized globally as one of the very best when it comes to P3s, and that is very much due to the approaches that have been taken over the years by Infrastructure Ontario. And they're making some changes now in order to ensure that they continue to be recognized globally as very best in class when it comes to P3s. So that makes this morning's session, I think, really timely and interesting. And I would also say that we have set some time aside for questions from the audience. We will have a microphone, and Daryl is here, and we'll have the microphone. He'll be available if you put your hand up when we get to the point around Q&A. And I hope you will give some thought to questions you might want to ask, and then we'll have the opportunity to do just that. So what I'd like to do now is actually, first of all, encourage you to follow us, converse about this morning's event using our hashtag, our Twitter handle @PPPCouncil. So please feel free to do that. And as I say, if you have any questions, begin thinking about them now. I'm going to ask Damien Joy to come up on stage. Damien, again, a partner with EY, who will introduce Ehren Khoury. Damien, please take the stand. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure today to introduce Ehren Khoury, President and CEO of Infrastructure Ontario. While he needs no introduction, he's going to get one anyway. As many of you know, Ehren has been with IO for 7 years after an earlier career at McKinsey. He started out with IO as Executive Vice President of Transaction Structuring and then was named President of the Project Delivery Division. Since 2017, he's been CEO of the provincial agency, Infrastructure Ontario, which is recognized as a world leader in the procurement and delivery of infrastructure. But Ehren and his team are not resting on their laurels. There's more to come. Last fall, IO reached out for insights from the infrastructure community to see how it could help improve the P3 model and drive further innovation. There's also further evolution through opportunities coming from the relatively new provincial government and from potential interaction with the federal government's Canada Infrastructure Bank. So, like many of us in the room, I'm excited to hear what Ehren and David have to tell us about what they've learned from the market, how they're adapting, and how they'll be helping create a more competitive and innovative market to ensure that Ontario remains the destination for the global infrastructure community. So, please welcome Ehren Khoury.
Thank you, Damien. It is a very powerful microphone, so I'm good? Yes? Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's great to have such a large room and room of our colleagues, partners, and the many people in this industry who contribute to the infrastructure we have. Damien, when you say something like we're well known around the world for our infrastructure work, for the portfolio we've delivered for the pipeline over the last 15 years, we always have to start by saying that is the efforts of an incredible number of people across the public and the private sector, and it's a success of this room and many more rooms filled like it to be where we are, so I appreciate that. I'm excited to be here today as David Ho's opening act, so I'm going to not steal much of his thunder, but I just want to talk for a minute about the approach we have been taking as an organization and will continue to take. I don't know what laurels are, but Damien's right, we're not resting on them. We talk at IO always about trying to have an attitude of being proud but never satisfied. Proud of the progress we've made, of the market we've developed along with all of you, and the work we're doing, but never happy with where it's at and always looking for what can we be doing better. So today is very much in that spirit of proud but far from satisfied. At IO, we operate on a core set of values, and those of you who've been to our offices, many of you have maybe seen on the wall our values. I'm going to do a test, show of hands, how many remember them? David, at least you, yeah. There's a number of IO people here. I don't see enough hands, thank you. The rest of you I won't quiz. Those values serve as the basis for a lot of our work, and I just would flag them for you because many of them affect you and they relate directly to what we're going to talk about today. One of them is the value of building great relationships. And all of our work, we think, is founded on the idea that delivering major infrastructure projects requires deep relationships within the public sector, so with our many partners, ministries, and agencies we work with, and also with the private sector. Now, having great relationships doesn't always mean you get along perfectly, doesn't mean you agree on everything. Actually, that's the value of great relationships. It allows you to have productive debate. It allows you to disagree constructively and get to a better place and still have a bond of trust and be able to deliver work. So having great relationships is one of those core values. A second is around operating effectively, transparently, openly, and with perfect fairness and transparency in all we do. And we think that's true in how you run a procurement, how we govern ourselves in an agency. There's a third, which is about people, and it's about us, but it's about the kind of partner we want to be and how we think we need to attract and retain people who can uniquely work in that space between the public and the private sector. It's not a skill that everyone has. You have to be able to translate between two worlds, both of which have incredible strengths. So our goal is to always be the translator, the communicator, and sometimes the challenger of both sides of that equation. So we need great people at the intersection who can live in both of those spaces. And then the fourth value, which is actually what we're here to talk about today, is the idea of building a culture of innovation. And note, we don't just say we need to innovate. We talk about how do we build a culture of innovation? How do we create an organization for ourselves that is constantly challenging our status quo, that is willing to take risk, or what feels like risk, because the easy course is often to say, what's the template say, what did we do last time, and go from there. So we're trying to build a culture that actually empowers people to do that. We're also trying to build a whole industry that is innovative and that is similarly willing to challenge conventional wisdom, try things differently. We know that risk comes with that, so not everything will go perfectly, but that we have a culture as an industry around being innovative. And so those four values, we think if we do those things well, sit at the center of us continuing to have the program we have. So if those are our values, and as I talk about building relationships and having a culture of innovation in particular, our engagement with the market is absolutely crucial to all that we do. And so as Damien mentioned, we hold market soundings and commercially confidential meetings, obviously in the context of any individual project, but we also do try and stop from time to time and hold broader conversations with industry participants to understand what you're seeing in our market, what you've seen in other jurisdictions that we can learn from, and what we can be doing to get better. And those dialogues are incredibly important. And consistent with that approach, many of you in this room will know and will have participated in the Minister of Infrastructure, coming out of last fall's C2P3 conference, embarked on a similar effort of engaging extensively with industry. As I say, many of you in the room may have participated in that, to gather feedback on and for him to hear and learn what's working, what can be done differently and better. And that kind of engagement at all levels, from us as an agency, from the government, I think is what you can continue to expect, and I hope it's what you've seen in the past, but even more so, it's what you're going to continue to see from us in the future, because it is what we think will allow us to continue to deliver on the incredibly ambitious infrastructure needs and goals of our province. Last month, the minister was overseas and announced some important changes coming out of his market sounding and dialogue with us around how to increase two things. Global competition, how do we make sure we're bringing the best of the world to Ontario and partnering and leveraging the best of the world combined with our strong local players? And second, how do we increase innovation? And so a whole set of ideas, which David will speak to, that are coming out of that consultation with industry that we've done to really figure out how can we not just talk those words, but actually live them. And I hope you're starting to see already some of the impact of that. So people in this room may already be noticing in projects like the Halton Courthouse, which is a live project for us right now, or certainly on the GO expansion project, which is our largest project to date. Both of those really you're seeing some of the changes in action, different approaches to everything from our scoring criteria, the way we qualify people, the way we're going to evaluate RFPs, how do we get the balance right between cost and quality, how do we drive innovation through our process. Hopefully you're already in a tangible way starting to see the signs of that in those projects. And going forward, you can expect to see even more. Going forward, David's going to talk more about what we're doing in those areas of driving global competition and innovation. But going forward, you're going to continue to see additional ideas come out from the minister, from his market sounding, from our work and our engagement at the grassroots with all of you as we continue to listen and adjust. I just end by saying we were really created as an agency to sit at that intersection between public and private, and we take that seriously. And so we're proud of the partnerships we've been able to build so far. We know they form an important part of what we do, and they're going to continue to. So we're open for listening. We're open for constantly hearing from you on what is and isn't working, and our job is to take that and translate it into meaningful change in the way that we deliver our projects. Events like today, we're going to have questions, but it's largely one way, but I just want to really remind everyone that we're committed to a two-way dialogue on this, as I know the government is, the Minister of Infrastructure is as well. So with that, I'm going to pause and leave it to David to talk in more detail about the kinds of changes we're making to drive those two areas of innovation and competition. But I just want to say thank you all for being here, and looking forward to this being an ongoing part of our dialogue together. Thank you.
Told that this was going to be a fireside chat, but there's neither a fire nor a chat involved, or a sofa. And I'm confined under this podium, and I'd prefer to be walking around amongst you, because I think, reflecting on what Ehren was saying, that this is actually truly a two-way dialogue. I'll just acknowledge members of the Minister's Office from the Ministry of Infrastructure who are here to also represent a real keen interest of the Minister in reinforcing that we are here to listen, and building upon Ehren's remarks of what it means for us to build great relationships, that we collectively want to signal that, working with all of you in this room over many years, we've been in many different commercially confidential meetings, and we've received many different requests for information and other commentary, and we acknowledge that sometimes it seems like we don't get it. But we do listen, and we do get it, and the challenges of being more innovative and being more competitive, or creating an environment of greater competition, are actually really wicked problems. And so trying to boil the ocean and solve all comments all simultaneously is exceedingly difficult. And in a mentality where we know that the success of really good project delivery and project management is now much more agile and requires a thinking of iterative change and assembly of a scrum mentality to say, okay, what can we fix? Let's fix that, and then keep moving on to the next problem. I think in that spirit, the Minister has convened the market sounding, and we've continued to meet with you to say, let's start tackling some things. And so as Ehren remarked, I'll just start. And part of this, I will acknowledge, is probably a little bit more technical in nature than we are accustomed to at gatherings like this. If it were truly our choice, this would be a commercially confidential meeting with 50 different parties simultaneously, and we just can't manage the logistics. And so, rather than trying to arrange a commercially confidential meeting with 50 simultaneous parties, here we go. And thanks to the Council for making this quasi-CCM a reality. So on the topic of innovation, I'll speak about innovation first and a couple of ideas, and then speak about competitiveness and a couple of ideas. And preface by saying these are not an exhaustive list of things that we're thinking about or working on, but they're the most concrete that we're thinking about right now. And we are sort of grateful for the Minister's announcement as signaling a beachhead of permissiveness to actually go for this stuff and make changes. In the realm of innovation, let's start with what it means to be procuring projects that have an output specification that is truly output-based and not prescriptive. I think we hear that comment and have heard that comment, and I think the Ministers has heard that comment very loud and repeatedly. And I think what we're trying to really encompass is that there needs to be a cultural change, a mindset of us as the interface between the program owners and sponsors, our partners, whether it be in health or at the Attorney General, corrections, Metrolinx, MTO, that as partners with our fellow ministries, how do we ensure that there is really successful program delivery for program owners and asset owners, whilst not being overly prescriptive in the specifications that we put out? And that means a whole bunch of number of things, because it can't simply be that we're always wrong in demanding or requiring certain levels of specification. Rather, there has to be much more forethought on what it means to be more output-based. And that forethought includes things like a much richer engagement with our advisors, whether planning design or technical advisory, and a cultural shift to allow for all of us to not be married to an illustrative design or reference concept design that is the only way of doing something. And what does it mean for us, therefore, not just to say we want to have less prescriptive output specifications, but what does it mean for us to completely change the dialogue that we have during design presentation meetings? So as Ehren alluded to, and as we're really, really proud to be testing as part of our Halton Courthouse RFP, and what we hope will be a model for ongoing change, is a real shift. And what does it mean to interact during the design presentation meeting? What does it mean to even lessen the prescriptiveness of the agenda in design presentation meetings, so that in the first meeting or the second meeting or third meeting, it's not our agenda that dominates what the dialogue is going to be about, but there has to be a greater room for an exchange of ideas during the open period. What does it mean for us to receive commentary on the spot and make a distinction between commentary we receive from those of you who are bidding who would say, this aspect of your output specification is incorrect. Surely you don't mean that. Well, it's incumbent on us to fix those. That comment is very, very different from a comment we would receive, which is, have you thought of this other way of doing it? Your output spec would not, does not seem to allow for this alternative way of doing it, but surely this is an okay way. Can you give us a sense of that? And we acknowledge that in the past, it has been our tendency, and it has been the tendency of public authorities, to use a very pure interpretation of fairness in process to respond by saying, we cannot answer that question, we'll take it back. And I think we're now at a mode of maturity where that's not an acceptable answer. And where there is true ambiguity that is being pointed out to us, where we want to be is to adopt a posture of saying, wow, that's a really interesting idea. Go ahead and do it, because it is exceedingly unlikely that the ultimate procurement test of whether a team fails a minimum technical score or not is going to be predicated on that singular interpretation. It's unlikely to be of such materiality. And us as an agency, and on behalf of and together with our co-sponsors, need to step into a place where we're accepting and allowing for and commenting back more readily on ideas that are different than what an illustrative design or reference concept design show. And that it is not necessarily incumbent on us to immediately broadcast that change for all of the other bidders in the pool by processing some sort of amendment to the output specification on the spot. So these are the kinds of conversations that we have to have, because it's not a one-size-fits-all procurement rule. And I often get accused, or my department often gets accused of, please give us the procurement rule or procurement advice. And truly, the response is, it ought to be a commercial response. It is respecting the principle of wanting to achieve the right programmatic outcome that has been approved by government, that is within the budgetary envelope for the project. Is it acceptable for us to start not comparing apples to oranges, but to start comparing a Gala apple against a Macintosh? And allowing for this kind of dialogue during design presentation meetings, and by reframing even the agenda, is one very minor way of starting that conversation of making output specifications less prescriptive. Yeah? Because the entire rubric of what that means is very large, and has implications much broader to what is the role of Infrastructure Ontario with our partners in upstream capital planning processes. And how can we even get to a place where the initial output specification that is published is less prescriptive, and what does that mean for discussions that we have in functional planning, and why does it take so long to diligence functional planning to the point that we're ready to issue documents that are quote-unquote ready for tender. That is another aspect of improvement that we're just starting to scratch the surface on, but I think is very, very front of mind. Another aspect of innovation that is quite technical, but I really understand that the vast majority of you get this, is the actual tools in our RFP documents, and specifically in evaluation. I think the minister signaled this, that there needs to be a willingness for us to recalibrate the manner in which we value submissions in order to drive innovative ideas. And let's just name it, that there is a certain way of scoring financial submissions, and there's a certain mathematical calculation of how we gear the scoring and the price, or net present value, guaranteed price, depending on your delivery model. And we know that that drives outcomes. And let us not be apologetic that on behalf of a taxpayer and on behalf of our overall accountability to government and to the ministry and to Treasury Board for making sure that we procure an approved scope for the best possible price, let us not be apologetic about the effectiveness of that methodology. But the question becomes, have we overshot? And have we made the most effective use of non-financial evaluation tools? Notice I use non-financial as the descriptor rather than to devolve into technical or design, because in fact, one of the things that we're also very proud to push forward with on our Halton project as a hopeful model of what is more to come is the idea that we need to move beyond this funny bifurcation of technical conformance scoring in opposition to great design ideas, and we need to move beyond the idea that good design is relegated to either two opposing dichotomies of, on the one hand, beautiful architecture, and on the other hand, really, really functional design. Actually, it's all supposed to work together. And actually, well-drafted specifications and well-drafted submission requirements cannot really have a divorce between technical conformance and great functional design, and it is also possible to have great architecture and design excellence, as certain of our partners refer to it. It is possible. So how do we value that? Changes of the way in which we weight those, and in particular, adjustments to lower the minimum scoring thresholds that are associated with these sections of the RFP evaluation. Those are our most immediate change to start entering into a conversation that admits that there is a imputed dollar value for every point in the RFP. We know that. And ascribing a greater dollar value to every point in the RFP means that there is a greater value that we really are placing on non-financial submission requirements. And that, coupled with the dialogue and the change of approach that we have during design presentation and the care and attention that we have to ensure that the right decision makers are in the room during commercially confidential meetings and in design presentation meetings, you add all of those things together, our hope is that we really get a better result in submissions. Can we empirically prove that today? We'll see. We can't. But I think all of the feedback that we've received, not just in market sounding or in the minister's market sounding, but over years, suggests it actually really is time to not rest on the laurels of just saying, you know what, DBFM and having long-term capital at risk is sufficient for driving innovation. That's actually, the presence of equity in and of itself is not sufficient, or at least it's not going to be enough to allow this jurisdiction and all of us who do deals here to remain truly innovative and competitive on a global scale. Let me move to the topic of competitiveness. Again, a wicked problem. Who is against wanting to have more competition? These are sort of very ethereal concepts. So in the practicality of it, what does this mean for us? I'll mention two things. When we qualify people in our request for qualifications, what do we really want? A request for qualifications process should be about how you work together, what you've done, and who do you bring. That's kind of it. Trying not to over-engineer those basic concepts and allow for as many possible configurations of private sector participants is what we're interested in. We have done ourselves a disservice over time, particularly in the realm of attaching a very, perhaps unnecessarily high bar associated with individual qualifications. And that manifests itself in two ways. One is a somewhat silly reliance upon the presence of key individuals at a stage in a project or a stage in the procurement where it is entirely reasonable that those same individuals will not actually be present for the commencement of construction and certainly not present for the turning of the asset into operations. So why is it that we rely so heavily on the individual qualification stage at an RFQ? I'll tell you why there is a really good principle. It's because we want the best and the brightest to actually be a part of the bid teams to properly help consortia understand what the deal is and the risk that's being taken on and to inform the best possible proposal. That's why we need the best and the brightest of individuals early on. But as I said, it would be silly for us to expect the exact same person of some remarkable global caliber to be present for eternity. That's actually just unreasonable. So reassessing our general reliance upon individual resumes and individual qualifications is something to look for. And I think if any of you who would have seen or studied the Go Expansion Encore request for qualifications, you would have known it was drastically different in its approach and to this end. And if you drill down on individual qualifications, let us also admit that out of a desire, a rightful desire to make sure that key components of the assets that our partners own and operate are protected from a regulatory, health and safety, programmatic delivery perspective, out of those very legitimate and very important concepts, we often overshoot with the number of credentials and qualifications and the number of years of experience for those credentials and qualifications, and those types of credentials and qualifications tend to be exclusionary to individuals from abroad who would have equivalent capability. And so part of the dialogue, and we're really, really pleased again that the minister's market sounding has signaled this and has created a beachhead, is that I think we feel in a very confident space to be able to work with our government partners to say, if you're going to require certain kind of Ontario certification for individuals, that had better be really absolutely necessary and limited to only those key individuals that are truly absolutely necessary, rather than a broad swath of individuals who are designated as key individuals and by being so designated cause problems in teaming. So we get that. So that's one very sort of minute change. And you say, well, how does that make a difference in overall competitiveness? It certainly doesn't solve the entirety of the wicked problem. But back to my earlier remarks, these are iterative elements. The second iterative element, and it goes to, again, reassessing what it is that we're trying to qualify. I said that we're trying to qualify how people work together, what you have done, and what do you bring to the table. So in this context, why is it that we ought to allocate a somewhat arbitrary bucketing of points for what we have designated, and all of you know, as local knowledge? In fact, the underlying principles within local knowledge are very sound. The care for health and safety, the care for a real demonstrated understanding of local permitting and regulatory and approval environments that really are critical in making construction successful. These are the kinds of underlying principles that we want to ensure are preserved, and preserved as part of general construction qualifications. But we also know that over time, this allocation, 10 points as you know it in local knowledge, actually has a point analysis impact for the remainder of the RFQ. And if we want to be cognizant of greater competition and cognizant of the differences between asset classes, we should have the freedom to reallocate points where they are valued most, whether it is in certain aspects of design or the design team, or whether it is, again, as you would have seen in the on-corridor RFQ, a significant emphasis on operations. These kinds of emphasis and point allocations are not possible within an arbitrary bucketing of 10 points, and so we will be really investigating what it means to change our framework for local knowledge to ensure that the underlying principles are captured within construction, but that we hopefully lessen the number of narrative requirements, and that we reallocate and have an ability to redistribute point totals generally. Again, why is this relevant to highlight as a change? Let us not forget that success for projects will always involve local partnerships, or partnering with the firms that have really made this jurisdiction successful. That is never going to go away, and that will never be subtracted as a recipe for success. But if we want to make as best use of the entirety of the RFQ, and we want to be true to the principle that what we care about is how do you work together, what have you done, and who do you bring to the table, then there's a greater purity that we can get to in our qualifications process. There's more I could talk about. I could probably go on for a long time. Many of you know me, know I like to just keep talking. But as Mark said, there should be time for questions and answers, and I think the most enriching time will be for those of you who've thought about competitiveness, innovation, and how it is that we can help. I'd love to just enter into that dialogue now and really just perpetuate this as a very, very large 50-party CCM.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much. Let's see if this is working. I hope, maybe not. Hello, good to have you here. Good to be here. We have set aside now about 20 minutes for a bit of a Q&A. And Daryl is right here, and we'll find you in the audience if you put your hand up because you've got a question that you'd like to ask. And so firstly, let me ask whether there is someone who would like to ask a question. One in the back. I've got a couple for you too, so don't worry. Like, it's not like you're gonna just walk off with a, easy run.
No.
And reference to the Starship Alliance Ontario. I know that the innovation vision has been something that Ehren and David have thought a long time about. Just sort of the top of the head question, I think you were starting to touch upon it, David, when you mentioned DBF and DBFOM. In terms of the point allocation system, if you're giving someone a longer contract, 30 years for example, a lot of that built-in thinking about how you allocate those points, I think, is probably less necessary than it would be with a DBF kind of a project, because the consortium is coming together, wants to do things that are going to be cost efficient and functional and design worthy over the long term to minimize those kind of asset management costs. So maybe, I think you're getting there, but maybe you can just elaborate on that for us.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. You're right. Let me just build on the distinction between P3 contracts that have a long-term period, whereas those that don't. Actually, just let's all reset the terminology for a moment. Any of our contracts that don't have a long-term component are actually just third-party arm's-length project finance availability-based construction contracts. That describes a build finance. Or third-party arm's-length project finance design and build contracts, and that describes design build finance. And for those in the global scale, people would look at what we do as build finance and design build finance, and many would say, that's not really a P3. That's just a third-party arm's-length project finance availability-based deal. So when we're talking about innovation, and we talk about it in the context of P3, there is, I think, a global presumption of a long-term component that drives a whole asset lifecycle mentality to the process. And look elsewhere on this continent or places for, what does it do to then transfer revenue risk, and that changes another, game. When we are just in a world of design build finance, there is absolutely a much better appreciation of the responsibility on the public sector as the operator, maintainer of the asset. We should expect there are going to be many more justified prescriptive decisions. That does not mean that we should be disregarding the principle of trying to be more output-based. That does not mean that we should be disregarding the principle of having better dialogue in DPM, and that does not mean we should ignore all of the benefit of that dialogue and a change of thinking. Whether there is as much a radical shift in the point allocation for design build finance projects, you are right, it would not be necessarily the same in a design build finance context as it would be in a DBFM, but that doesn't mean there's room for change. I think there is room for change, and as we are starting with Halton, as we will be absolutely changing the mentality with on-corridor, so too will we be looking at what we can do differently in a design build finance context. So I hope that answers it. Great.
I'm not going to stand, but David, is there any way to narrow the range of cost estimation for projects when they're first advertised?
So are you referencing, Jensen, like what has previously been on the pipeline published?
Yeah, that's correct. I know you have you do grade them. You have letter grades.
Right.
For the size of the projects. I'm just wondering if there's any way to kind of narrow those ranges at such an early stage.
And to understand that correctly, for everyone who doesn't have context, so what Jensen you're referring to is that in the past, when Infrastructure Ontario has published a pipeline, categorization of the project has been by a large estimated capital dollar value, and I assume, knowing who you work with, that part of the narrowing of that range is to have everyone get a better appreciation of the order of magnitude for sizing of equity, et cetera, yeah. So I think the methodology of the pipeline, or at least the cosmetic format of it, does not need to be the same as it has been in the past. I think that we recognize deeply that a pipeline document has various different purposes. Some of those purposes are absolutely at the pleasure of the government to announce what it is that's on its agenda. But we know that within many of you here, there has been a historical reliance on what a pipeline is for the purposes of teaming. I would love to get to a place where we can balance those interests by having a more regular and less glossy update of what our information looks like, so that we don't have to overload once a year or once every 18 months a singular disclosure, because I don't know exactly how to answer the narrowing question of the dollar range, other than to say that depending on what project is disclosed in the pipeline, there are actually different government approvals, depending on the stage of where things have gone through at Treasury Board. And so really the best information is there. And we would, of course, not be in the business of trying to disclose a pre-tender estimate. So, I mean, I think we are mindful of giving the best information possible, but the format could change. Ehren has more to say.
I'll answer that. But David, and I just like your question. If you look at our pipeline today, I can't remember letter G or H, whatever it is, but it's bigger than, it's either 500 million or a billion, but it's everything bigger than that. And I think that's designed for a time frame when our projects, in the social side, the average project size was at a certain range. But as we do bigger transit projects, that still leaves lots to the imagination. It's just H category G or whichever it is, this is big. So if what you're saying is, can we give a bit more gradation of the bigs, because there's a difference between $1 billion and 2 and 5, I think that's, we do the same thing in the 100 million range, why wouldn't we? And I think our project size as we do transit has shifted. So yeah, I think that's absolutely what we're looking at.
Canada's another question down the way there, so there, you can head down there. In the meantime, it might take you a little while to get there. Another question on my mind, you talked a little bit about thinking around the local knowledge criteria. Can you talk a bit more about what thinking is internally around how to connect small and medium-sized businesses in the industry to projects, and maybe more specifically with international bidders on these projects?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think local knowledge, as it is as set up in the RFQ, is designed for what we call the prime construction team members. And prime construction team members are those sort of tier 1 global construction suppliers. It is a different matter to talk about what is the level of involvement further down in the supply chain. I would say two things. One, as I said before, projects that we do here cannot be successful without great local partnership. And that message, I want that to ring clear. On smaller, small business, medium business enterprises, I think there's always a desire to make sure that there's a maximum amount of involvement. We know perhaps a different way of answering that is there's going to be a lot of work, and I'll shift gears for a moment to say, in the realm of cost estimation, if there's something that keeps me up at night and gives me a little bit of nervousness, it is the cost of labor and inputs over the coming cycle of time, because there's going to be a lot of work. So I don't think there needs to be a overly fearful concern that changes in the point allocation methodology and the evaluation criteria structuring of local knowledge have any impact whatsoever on the ability of companies down in the supply chain to participate. They're quite unrelated. The change to local knowledge is about ensuring that we have the maximum degrees of freedom in our RFQ to evaluate in a manner that incentivizes as many global and tier 1 firms to participate at that prime construction team member level. Matters down in the supply chain, we at IO, we're not interventionists in that. We trust that these your tier 1 suppliers, you know what your supply chain is, and that's what we're trying to qualify. But because there's going to be a lot to do, I think there's going to be still a lot of opportunity.
Hi, David. Mark Frisco from WSP. Thank you for your perspective. Got two related questions. One, within IO, is there interest and incentive to drive innovation post-award? Talk a lot about innovation during the open period, and then it all seems to disappear under concerns for proper risk mitigation during the delivery process. And then the second part of the question, perhaps leading a little unfairly into this one, what is the interest in IO about IPD delivery models that might relate to taking that innovation throughout the complete delivery process?
Actually, the second question isn't as a spicy meatball as you think. On the topic of delivery model, okay, we're not dogmatic. We need to move beyond. I think we're really proud. I can see my colleague Eric Eric Tilley and the team. Our transaction finance team has spent a great deal of effort in the last several months thinking of how to move to a better qualitative, well-rounded delivery model assessment tool that admits that this sliver of what we have done in Ontario, which is the third-party arm's length project finance availability-based deal, like that's a sliver. And I have a moderate sort of physics analogy. If that's the visible spectrum of the rainbow, then there's ultraviolet and there's infrared and there's X-ray and there's all that other stuff out there, and we've just done the visible spectrum of the rainbow. These are all tools, and it should not be one size fits all. That is not to say that I can immediately recite for you the project that I think is coming down the pipe that would be fit for IPD or Alliance or some other version of partnership structure, but I can absolutely say that our minds are not closed to it at all and are very much willing to explore what alternative delivery models there are for capital projects. Your first question of what does it mean to contemplate capital I or lowercase I innovation after a contract has been executed. Well, look, within the rubric of a third-party arm's length project finance availability-based deal, we all know what the constraints are and the number of interests, both debt and equity and fixed price and government approval that there are. And so I would just say it truly is incumbent on us to get it better and right during procurement. Again, does that mean that we're completely closed in our minds to really transformative ideas post-contract execution? Not at all. I do find it difficult to imagine what that looks like during construction, but I can certainly imagine more and more of our projects entering into operations over a 30-year life where things like technology, which will change on a very, very fast cycle, and how many generation changes of technology will there be over the next 35 years, I have to imagine that is going to drive some really interesting conversations. So in that aspect of the contract and the DBFM and DBFOM asset class, I suppose all of us will stay tuned.
Thanks very much.
Time for one last question. Right behind you, Darrell. There you go.
Charles Wheeler, Vice President of Transit for Contact. David, I've known you to pound the keyboard pretty hard myself, so if you want to do a little over it. My question relates to mechanics, and you're wanting to have a more innovative process, and so much of it depends on the facilitator that's standing in the front of the room, the man or the woman who's answering the questions and is saying, we'll take it away. So how do you translate the objective of having a more open DPM process down through the organization to people that are actually facilitating these discussions and are going to implement
Right.
that more creative process?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it starts by saying that when I go back to the office, I can tell everyone on our team that I said these things in a room full of everyone who is listening, and so we actually have to do that. Look, this is culture change, right? So don't, you might look at me or any of us as the process guys for what do we do, the process, the tools. No, this is culture change, and culture change happens with intentional, repetitive communication and demonstrated commitment. It involves training, a different approach in onboarding, a different approach in how we value and celebrate good stuff that's done, a different approach in quality management of capturing lessons learned on the spot rather than allowing for a project to conclude and everyone get frustrated and say, hey, the next time we procure that, we should do it different. No, it has to be much more iterative. There has to be a willingness for more people to fail. By the way, like, we've listened and we're trying stuff, and part of our objective here is that we want to try stuff and we might get it wrong, but that's actually better than not trying. So what you point out, Charles, is actually a question about what are we doing on culture change, and you and anyone else in a complex corporate organization, you know that there is no magic formula or process to manufacture culture change. So that's how I name that issue.
Thank you, David, very much for taking those questions. I really do appreciate it.
It's fun.
Great to have you here.
Thanks, Mark.
One thing that I will say is that, again, comes back to your question, Charles, and I think Ehren set the scene very well, that I think what you're seeing here is a very close and active partnership at both the political level in terms of the minister and the ministry and cabinet for that matter, and Infrastructure Ontario. And I think that's hugely beneficial. They may both go down the road the wrong way, at which point this organization and folks in the room will have a chance to make that point again. But the fact that both are so synchronized in how they're moving ahead is a hugely positive development. I hopefully everyone will agree as they see the program roll out in its changing iteration that in fact is reflected on a day-to-day basis. So I don't work for IO yet, so I but that's my read of it, and I think that's pretty important. So again, thank you, Ehren, for setting the scene and for hanging in there and for taking the microphone on a question. And David, thank you for allowing yourself to be the object of a little bit of enthusiastic response. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.